Welcome to the second tier of our alien abduction, incident, and encounters iceberg. Today we'll be covering our first three entries: the Flatwoods Monster, the Falcon Lake Incident, and the Eagle River Close Encounter. And once again, these are in no particular order, and I'll put them all together once the whole thing's done. That being said, let's go ahead and hop into it. The Flatwoods Monster. Around sunset, September 12, 1952, four boys were playing on the lawn of the Flatwoods Elementary School. These boys, Edward May, Freddie May, Neil Nunley, and Tommy Heyer, were all from this small town of Flatwoods, which was made up of only about 300 residents at that time. As they were playing on the grass with a football, they would come to see a bright light streak across the sky. As the four boys stared up into the darkening sky at this bright object, they would see it crash into the hillside in the distance. Looking like it had crashed on the nearby farm of resident G. Bailey Fisher, the group ran by Freddie May's house to ask for permission to go out and check it out. The young boys were very adamant that they go and investigate and told the mother, Kathleen May, the story as fast as they could, all while begging. Kathleen decided to accompany the kids, but only after contacting National Guardsman Eugene Lemon, who quickly made his way over to the Mays house. Once they had all grouped up, the four boys, the mother, the National Guardsman, and the family dog all left on foot heading towards the hill where the object appeared to have crashed. After walking for about a quarter of a mile, they reached the farm and started to make their way up to the top of the hill. They first spotted a strange pulsating red object in the distance. Then they were met with a thick mist which reeked of a metallic sulfur-like smell and also burned their eyes. Lemon, taking the lead, would pull up his flashlight in the direction of the pulsating light, giving the whole group a glimpse of this terrifying creature. Under an oak tree, they saw a tall being around 7 to 10 feet tall. It was covered with a heavily folded black and green metallic fabric resembling a dress. Its legs seemed to be invisible and the creature appeared to be hovering off the ground. Its arms were extended away from its body, showing off its small claw-covered hands. The face was flat and shaped like a spade, and also had a green or orange-reddish skin tone. It had a dark hood draped around its face with animal-like eyes staring out at them from underneath. This creature would then let out a blood-curdling screech and bounded or glided towards them. The flashlight was only on the creature for 2 or 3 seconds until the 17-year-old Lemon dropped it out of terror. When it hit the ground, the light went out, and by the time they got it turned back on, the creature had vanished. They figured it must have changed paths, as none of the witnesses were hurt in any way. Feeling unwell and also very frightened, the group rushed back to the Mays household. The children were complaining of a burning feeling in their throats as well as nausea, something they felt that might have come from inhaling the mist on the hillside. Some of these symptoms would last for days after this incident. Lemon himself reported suffering from vomiting and convulsions for the rest of the night. Right away, Miss May would contact the Braxton County Sheriff, Robert Carr, as well as Mr. Stewart, who owned the local newspaper. The sheriff, oddly enough, wasn't able to come out right away as he was investigating a report of a crashed airplane in the area. Stewart, however, wasted no time and started to interview witnesses and other local people. He would go on to get reports from 20 different people with a variety of incidents occurring. Many claimed to see some sort of object flying through the sky, but other reports would include houses being shaken by heavy impacts as well as radio disturbances. He would also go out to where the incident took place, with Stewart reporting, quote, "a sickening burnt metallic odor still prevailing." Later that night, Sheriff Carr was finally able to go out to the scene, with both him and his deputies saying that they saw, heard, and smelled nothing. The next morning, Mr. Stewart returned to have a second look during the daytime and happened across 2 large skid marks in the grass, which were also speckled with a black, thick, oily substance. This story would soon make the front page of the newspaper with the title, "7 Braxton County residents on Saturday reported seeing a 10-foot Frankenstein-like monster in the hills above Flatwoods." Quickly afterwards, this story was picked up by both national newspaper and radio agencies, leading to Gene Lemon and Miss May appearing on CBS News one day to discuss their encounter. Lemon would describe the creature they saw as a, quote, "Frankenstein-like monster, a man-like figure with a round red face surrounded by pointed hood-like shape." And later, a 10-foot monster with a blood-red body and a green face that seemed to glow. Shortly after, Gary Barker would go on to record witness testimonies, as well as gather reports from a number of other locals within a 20-mile radius. Writing an article for Fate magazine, Barker would bring even more attention to this case. The following year, he would go on to publish a book with more information on the Flatwoods encounter, as well as his conclusions on the case. He himself thought the case may be authentic, claiming that the sickness caused by the fumes were consistent with extraterrestrial activity. A popular paranormal writer, Ivan Ho, as well as a UFOologist, Major Donald Kehoe, also decided to visit the Fisher's farm. They investigated the scene and interviewed the witness once again, going on to conclude that it was very probable that this was an authentic case of alien contact. This wasn't the only alien sighting investigated in the area either. Just a few days before the Flatwoods incident, a Mrs. Harper would make her own report to local authorities. Just 5 miles north from the town of Heaters, Harper and her friend were on a walk to a nearby store. Deciding to take a shortcut through a wooded area, the two would come to notice what looked like a ball of fire on a hill within the trees. They were about half a mile into the forest at this point and thought that one of their neighbors must be out fox hunting and continued on their walk. However, after a few minutes, Harper glanced back towards the hill and was surprised to see that the fire had completely vanished. And frighteningly, in its place stood a tall, dark silhouette of a man-shaped figure. The two friends were terrified and quickly ran around the hill, making their way into town. Then, just one day after the sighting of the Flatwoods Monster, another similar report would come in just 20 miles south in the area of Strange Creek. A married couple, George and Edith Snitowski, along with their 18-month-old, were driving in the rural area between Clay and Braxton County on Route 4. The car suddenly died, forcing them to pull over. With no other cars on the road, George tried to get the car running again himself, but was unable to do so. It was already getting dark out at this point, and the couple started to discuss what they should do to get out of this situation. Their baby began to cry. That's when they began to smell a foul, sulfur-like odor fill the air around them. Out of nowhere, a bright light illuminated the area, and the two would then witness a 10-foot-tall creature hovering in front of their vehicle. Here, some speculate the couple had just seen the same monster, but without the spade-like hood, as they report a similar description. They claim to have seen a bony reptilian being dragging its lizard-like hand across the hood of their car before disappearing into the woods. Once the creature was out of sight, the couple immediately hopped back into their car, which was then able to start without issue. They then sped away as fast as they could. Later, George would give his testimony to Mail magazine, who would publish the article about the incident in 1955. After hearing of these events, an investigator, a Mr. Nickel, would go on to try to find more earthly explanations for these events. On the night of the Flatwoods encounter, a meteor had been seen over 3 different states, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. Both astronomers and Air Force officials would confirm this, verifying that the object seen in the sky that night was indeed a meteor. They even claimed that when it crashed in the ground, it caused some alarms to go off, and that's what caused the sheriff to be out investigating a downed plane that night. Now, many believe that what the kids saw that day was actually this meteor crashing into the hillside on the Fisher's farm. Nickel even claims that when you're on the top of the hill at night, you can see some aircraft hazard beacons on the horizon. These beacons also emitted a pulsating red light, just like what the witnesses described seeing during their encounter. Trying to explain the creature that they had seen, Nickel concluded that they had most likely seen an agitated barn owl perched on a tree limb. The silhouette shape of the being and the fact that it stretched before gliding towards them also fits his theory. Continuing, he claims that the plants below the owl could have also given the illusion of the lower proportions, which were described as green and/or black. When interviewing the witnesses, he also finds that they are unable to agree on whether or not the monster had arms. With Miss May describing the creature as having small claw-like hands extending in front of it, Nickel is convinced that this is a description of a barn owl gripping a tree branch with its talons. Another skeptic, Ryan Humpt, has come out stating that a local boy later admitted to having driven up to the scene that night, hoping to see something. Ryan states that the tracks and the oily substance found at the scene that day could have been explained by the old Chevy truck that the boy drove. This would also explain why none of the people that went to investigate the first night had seen any of this. Ryan also states that the nausea reported by witnesses are, quote, consistent with hysteria and overexertion. Over time, these stories have become a sort of folk tale, with these incidents influencing the culture of the surrounding area. And although the location of the crash is still private property, the nearby towns have integrated the Flatwoods Monster into their communities. In Flatwoods itself, there's an ice cream shop with a painting of the creature, which has become a popular spot for passerbys to take pictures. A few miles south on the town of Sutton, there's even a museum dedicated to the Flatwoods encounter. The area also boasts of 5 huge chairs painted in the monster's image placed throughout the Braxton County. Flatwoods officials have now erected a sign designating their town as home of the Green Monster. There's also an annual Flatwoods Festival honoring the legend of the Flatwoods Monster itself. The locals, also calling him Braxy or the Braxton Monster, celebrate this famous encounter with a parade, music, games, and most importantly, a pancake breakfast. The Falcon Lake Incident. This incident all took place in Manitoba, Canada, near the area of Falcon Lake. This is around 75 kilometers or 46.5 miles away from the American border on a rocky edge of the Great Canadian Shield. Falcon Lake is a small resort town next to the White Shell Park, which is a largely uninhabitable wilderness. The park is, however, known for its various mineral deposits, with several small mines popping up throughout the area. Some prospectors have even found quartz veins which were known to be associated with silver deposits. A 50-year-old industrial mechanic and an amateur geologist, Stefan Michalak, had his own claims in this park and would occasionally come up here on the weekends to do some of his own exploring and prospecting. On May 19, 1967, Michalak, planning to do just this, would leave his house in Winnipeg and make his way up to Falcon Lake. After staying the night in a motel, he started out into the park early the next day, planning to stay out the rest of the weekend. It was 12:12 p.m., and after walking a ways away from society, he would become distracted from his adventure when some geese nearby began to squawk loudly out of nowhere. Looking up into the sky, Michalak would come to see 2 disc-shaped objects descending together at an angle of 15 to 20 degrees. In one report, he stated that at first they appeared to look like, quote, cigarette-shaped things with humps in the middle. One of these craft stopped and hovered about 15 feet off the ground, while the second flew 160 feet away, landing on the flat top of a rock outcropping. These craft appeared to be about 35 feet in diameter, 15 feet in height, and each had a large dome on the top of them. The hovering craft stayed in place for about 3 minutes as Michalak stood there watching. It then took off in the same direction it came from, all while changing colors. It started as a bright red, but then changed to an orange, then to gray, and then back to orange, but much brighter than before. It moved faster than any airplane he had ever seen, and made no noise as it flew off into the distance. He turned towards the landed craft, which seemed to still be unaware that he was even there. It was also changing color from an orange to the glowing red of a hot stainless steel. He also noticed an intense purple-like shining from some sort of aperture around the dome. It also seemed to be wafting a sulfuric-smelling warm air towards him while making a hissing sound. He couldn't see any markings on the craft and believed that it must be some secret U.S. military experimental airship. With this thought in his mind, he was unafraid and decided to sit back and sketch the craft for the next half hour. He sat and observed the object for another 15 minutes when he noticed the hatch on the side had opened up. He tried to walk around and get a glimpse of the inside, but a very intense bright light made it impossible for him to make anything out. He thought he could hear 2 muffled voices conversating with each other, one higher pitched and one lower pitched. He then approached to within 60 feet of the craft, calling out to them, saying, "Okay, Yankee boys, having trouble? Come on out and we'll see what we can do about it." Then the voices went silent and no one would come to answer him. He had the thought that maybe they weren't Americans after all, and tried to communicate in Polish, Russian, German, Italian, French, and even Ukrainian. Still left without a response, he had the idea of going back to his camp to retrieve his welding goggles. He had them with him for protection for when he was chipping away at rocks. Returning and putting the goggles on, he made his way even closer to the craft than before. He could see a golden glow surrounding the object as it changed from a red to a gray color, resembling colored glass. He noted that the entire thing was completely smooth and had no seams. Walking closer to the hatchway, he could see light beams emanating out. He also noted that the interior walls were made of a honeycomb material and about 20 inches thick. Suddenly, 3 panels converged over the hatchway, with Michalak later describing it as looking like it was sealing like a camera shutter. He reached out to touch it with his gloved hand as he examined the outside of the craft up close. Pulling his hand back, he noticed the tips of his gloves were now melted and burned. Suddenly, the craft rotated in place, bringing the grid-shaped exhaust vent he had sketched earlier directly in front of him. This vent was comprised of a uniform pattern of holes around 1/16 inch in diameter and was about 6 inches wide and 9 inches tall. Before he could move out of the way, a large blast of hot gas shot out of these holes right into his chest, setting his clothes on fire. He tore his clothes off as quickly as possible, stomping out the flames, but was still left with intense burns on his abdomen. After putting out all of the fire, he retrieved his partially burned undershirt and his cap. His outer shirt had, however, almost completely burned up, and also lit some nearby moss on fire as well. Michalek then felt a burst of air, looking up to see the craft depart just as the first had. He put out the burning moss and made his way back to the camp that he had left his belongings at. Then he would come to see his compass needle spinning erratically for a few minutes before calming down and becoming still. Shortly afterwards, he decided to make his way back over to the landing site to investigate a second time. He was, however, beginning to feel a bit sick. Once he was back, he would note that the landing site looked as if it had been swept clean of all sticks and stones. In a clear disc shape, the missing debris had been piled up along the edges of where the craft had been. He continued to feel more nauseous and dizzy, and he broke out into a cold sweat. Feeling weak, he decided to gather his things and make his way back to the motel. He would have to stop and vomit frequently, and decided to walk along the highway in hopes of finding help. Stefan would find and request help from a Canadian constable who was driving by, but this constable would refuse to help him, thinking that he was intoxicated and just left him to walk down the highway by himself. He also tried to get help at the park's headquarters, but they didn't want anything to do with him either. He claims to also be aware of a foul odor coming off of him at this point as well. He finally arrived back at his motel room, where he packed up, deciding to leave for the weekend. As he sat there, waiting for the bus back home, he would make a call to the Winnipeg Tribune, asking for their assistance and also stating that he wanted no publicity. Once Michalek was back in Winnipeg, he would meet up with his son, and they would end up going to the Winnipeg hospital. They would diagnose the burns as superficial and saw no need to keep him there, so they sent him back home. However, afterwards he would continue to suffer from this extreme nausea and weight loss, headaches, and a quote, offensive odor coming from his lungs. Years later, in an interview, his son, Stan Michalek, would make a statement about seeing his dad in this condition, saying, "I recalled seeing him in bed. He didn't look good at all. He looked pale, haggard. Then there was the smell. When I walked in the bedroom, there was a huge stink in the room, like a real horrible aroma of sulfur and burnt motor oil. It was all around, and it was coming out of his pores. It was very bad." 2 days later, Stefan would go to a radiation pathologist wanting to investigate the burned areas. But they didn't find any radiation, not on his burns, in his blood, or even on his clothes that he'd been wearing at the time. He would also go on to have a whole body radiation count, a test used to detect gamma radiation from isotopes. But again, no evidence was found. It was a total of 11 days before he would fully recover, with him claiming to have lost over 22 pounds. After hearing all this, an unnamed project investigator would head out to speak with Michalek as soon as he was feeling better. After an interview, the investigator wanted to lead a search back out into the location in hopes of finding the landing site. Seeing that it had already been about 2 weeks, he wanted to get out there as fast as possible in hopes that the landing site was still visible. The day before the trip was planned, Stefan would develop a rash around his neck, which he seemed to relate to the sickness from the previous encounter. Reluctantly, he still went on to lead the search, but seemed uncertain of his health. The search party would make their way into the park, which was covered in a dense vegetation. They were trying to make their way over to the outcropping that he had seen the craft land on. However, the investigator found this search to be aimless, and reported that Michalek expressed the desire to terminate the search after only a few hours of hiking. They pressured him to continue, but by early afternoon, the party was certain that they wouldn't be finding the landing site that day. They would also talk with Conservation Officer Jim Bill, who would tell them of all the nearby fire towers. The forest was quite dry this time of year, and he felt that any fire at all could have started a forest fire. He claimed that even if a small amount of smoke was made, it probably would have been noticed by one of the rangers at these nearby towers. But the watchman had reported nothing on that day. The investigator also noted that the flight path that Stefan had pointed out would place the craft above a golf range as it flew away. However, he was unable to find any witnesses under its flight path. A Corporal Davis that was in the search party had also reported a large number of black flies and was severely bitten while out that day. He also developed a rash, just like Michalek had before they went out on the search. This investigator would state that Michalek seemed honest, sincere, and concerned, and that his story was overall pretty convincing. He also had the chance to look at the clothes Stefan had been wearing, as well as the wounds themselves. He would note that the shirt was ripped in the front, but did also show a clear burn pattern. He would also see a small pattern on the same spot on the back of the shirt, but stated, the reason for the presence of the pattern burn on the back of the undershirt was not obvious. The investigator would also interview his wife and child, who would verify his claims of being ill, and would add that an odor would permeate the bathroom after Michalek had bathed. Just a little more than a month later, Stefan would reach out to this investigator once again to tell him, on September 30th, I returned to the place where the craft had landed to see if there were any other changes. I could not believe what I saw. The leaves in the area looked as if they had been sprayed with some sort of killing chemical. All were withered and dead. No vegetation grew within a 50-foot radius of the landing site. The area where the craft had touched down was still visible. The investigator felt this was a little suspicious and decided to look into the mineral claims in that area. He would discover that Michalek did indeed have claims in that same area as the landing site, but these claims hadn't been filed until after the previous search. The investigator felt that Stefan deliberately misdirected the earlier search to protect these mineral claims. This time, the search party was able to go directly to the landing site, with the circular pattern and the debris still obvious. The party would collect samples of the soil, moss, and shirt fragments that they could find there, as well as a measuring tape that he had left behind during his original encounter. The samples were taken to a nearby unnamed town where they were found to be highly radioactive. So strongly radioactive that the Radiation Protection Division of the Department of Health and Welfare considered restricting entry to that area of the park. They even sent another team out to test the area of the park further. However, they found no unusual radiation in the surrounding areas. The team did, however, find a smear of contamination on the top of the rock the craft had supposedly landed on. They would also note that the site was a bit different from what Stefan had described, saying that the craft would have had to fly in from the opposite direction that he had originally indicated. The investigator would end the case at this point, stating that if Stefan's experience was real, then it would show the existence of flying alien vehicles. He would also state that while trying to establish proof of this event, he would come across many inconsistencies and incongruities within the case. Even after finding the landing site and the radioactive samples, it still wasn't enough to alter the original conclusion, stating, "This case does not offer probative information regarding unconventional aircraft." Stefan has been described as sincere, intelligent, and level-headed, and also well-read in many subjects. It's said that it was quite obvious that their notoriety was an annoyance to him, and that he also seemed to be defensive when asked for further details of the encounter. It seems that he was subject to severe ridicule and criticism once the incident first hit the media. Many people have also called this a hoax, saying that he had burned himself and actually wanted all the fame. But not much more than theories have been put forth. If Stefan Michalek was a lone hoaxer, he would have required a number of different resources, as well as the stamina to keep up his story until his death more than 25 years later. The Eagle River Close Encounter. Out in Wisconsin, just a few miles north of the Michigan border, there is a thinly populated section known as Eagle River. Located in the Northwoods area, it's home to many lakes and forests that attract visitors from all over. However, some prefer the simple life, settling down here and enjoying the natural beauty of the environment. One of these local residents, Joe Symington, was a plumber, an auctioneer, and an annual Santa for the Eagle River community. He lived alone out on his chicken farm and was known to be a very humble man. It was April 18th, 1961. Around 11 a.m., he was eating an early lunch when he would become startled by a loud sound outside of his home. The noise was also quite peculiar, with Symington saying it sounded like, quote, knobby tires on wet pavement. He got up to look out the window, where he was shocked to see a silvery metallic machine descending into his yard. He went to go investigate, stepping out of his house, when some kind of hatch opened on the side of the craft. Describing this object, he would say that it was a silvery saucer shape that's brighter than chrome. The machine didn't quite land either, with it hovering just off the ground without actually touching it. The object appeared to be about 12 feet tall and 30 feet in diameter, with the hatch open about 5 feet off the ground. Looking inside this craft, he would see 3 strange men, 2 of which were wearing blue 2-piece suits, with the third wearing black with red trim. They also wore turtlenecks and knitted caps resembling what one would wear underneath a crash helmet. The hatch was open about 6 feet high and 30 inches wide, giving him full view of the men inside. All 3 of the men appeared to be about 5 feet tall and in their late 20s or early 30s. They didn't seem to speak English and were completely silent. Symington described them as resembling, quote, smooth-shaven Italians, having dark skin, eyes, and hair. One of these men stepped into the hatch as he walked closer to the craft. The man communicated with him by making drinking motions, indicating that they wanted some water. The man also held out a silvery jug, looking to be made of the same material as the machine. Joe took the jug inside and filled it up for them before walking back out to the craft. Returning, he would notice more of the interior, which looked the color of wrought iron. He also saw several instrument panels and heard a slow whining sound similar to a generator. It also seemed that one of the men was, quote, frying food on a flameless grill of some sort. Joe would make a gesture showing an eating motion, trying to show that he wanted to try some of their food. The man dressed in black seemed to understand him and reached out to hand him 3 cookie-like pancakes. They were somewhat hard, about 3 inches in diameter, and were perforated with lots of small holes. The man closest to the opening then attached a sort of belt to himself before the hatch closed. The hatch had closed so smoothly against the rest of the craft that its outline was now barely even visible. Joe would now notice several tubes around 6 inches in diameter around the edge of the saucer, assuming that these must be the craft's exhaust pipes. This craft would then suddenly rise up about 20 feet up into the air, while also turning at a 45-degree angle, all while humming. It then took off towards the south, causing a large blast of air that would bend the nearby pine trees. It was completely out of sight within just a few seconds. Symington stood there, with his mouth wide open, 4 warm pancakes still in hand. He ate one, later stating, they tasted like cardboard. He would then call up the local sheriff, who he had personally known for years, and that sheriff sent 2 deputies to come out and check out the scene. However, no evidence of this encounter could be found, and although they didn't find anything, the sheriff did confirm that he believed the witness did indeed see something that day, and he seemed to be talking sensibly. Soon after, the Air Force would become involved and actually took the pancakes in, sending one to the Food and Drug Laboratory of the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare for analysis, and they appeared to just be normal, poorly prepared pancakes. They were made up of flour made from soybean and wheat bran and also contained grease and sugar. They also couldn't find any unusual bacteria or radiation coming off of them. One Air Force officer would make a comment on this, saying, "It was rumored, however, that the wheat in the pancake was of an unknown type." Speaking for the U.S. Air Force, Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who investigated the case, stated, "There is no question that Mr. Symington felt that his contact had been a real experience." Soon, more locals would come forward with their own stories of strange lights and otherworldly visitors. One author, John Kell, would later state that while investigating the event, he would come across some corroborating evidence. The same day, an insurance agent was traveling down Highway 70, just 1 mile away from the Symingtons' farm. This is when he would see a saucer-shaped craft rising diagonally into the air, flying parallel with the highway. There were many other reports of UFO sightings in the area as well, with a large amount between 1959 and 1963. The Air Force would later go to the press attempting to explain these events. It was stated that there had been several accidents over the years, with 2 happening in the same year as Symington's encounter. On February 24th, a B-47 would crash just 60 miles north of Eagle Creek. Then again, on May 2nd, that same year, another B-47 would crash just 2 miles away from where the first one had gone down.
Right here is where this flying saucer, this UFO, landed. Right here about where I'm standing. I looked out the window, and that's when I first saw this thing coming straight down, just like an elevator. I rushed out to see what it was, and by that time, there was a hatchway opening up in the top of it, just like the trunk of your car. And in there stood a little man, I say a little man, about 5 foot tall, holding up a jug or a container, and he motioned he wanted to drink. He motioned for water. And I looked at his eyes, and they were so penetrating that I had to look away. And I handed the jug up with both hands, and I had that same look in his eyes, a sort of a penetrating look. With that, he set the jug down, and he gave me a salute with the back of his hand, a gesture of thanks, I presume. And then, well, I gave him my salute. What am I going to do? I noticed this little man, the same size of a man, right to the right side of the hatchway, cooking these pancakes, which I have one here yet. He was frying these pancakes. I pointed to him and made a gesture like eating. I thought maybe I'd get a conversation out of him. Nobody was saying anything. He didn't say a word. He just reached over and he got a handful of them, 4 of them, and he handed them down to me. The man cooking these pancakes, it was on a square grill-like concern. I couldn't see any flame, but it seemed to be very hot. There was smoke coming from it. God help him, because I took a bite of one of them, and it tasted like a piece of cardboard. And if that's what they lived on, no wonder they're small. And with that, the thing started to raise, just like it came down. Everything was timed perfect. It went up about 20 feet. It tilted at 45 degrees, straight south, and shot off. And within 2 or 3 seconds, it was out of sight. Well, there I stood in the driveway with a handful of greasy pancakes and my mouth open, wondering what the heck I'd saw, what had happened.
But unfortunately, like most of these cases that we see on this channel, it was never solved, with many of these explanations just not very satisfying or completely believable. It was, however, interesting enough for the Air Force to make a detailed investigation into the matter, listing it as unexplained in the end. Officially, they stated in their report that they believed Simonton had been dreaming while awake, inserting the dreams into the continuum of the events around himself. This explanation seems to satisfy both the locals and the UFOologists alike that were still asking about this event. Joe, however, didn't seem to like all the attention that he was getting in the reports after they were published in the local and national newspapers, stating, "If it had happened again, I don't think I'd tell anybody about it." Thanks for making it this far, everyone, and be sure to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't done that already. My channel's still growing, so I appreciate all your help and your support. Be sure to leave a comment if you have any suggestions for future videos. If you like this type of stuff, be sure to check out my other videos. I have a few other on this iceberg as well. This was Matt, and I want to believe.